Chesterton is an author who gets referenced quite a bit in Jorge Luis Borges' essays, but even sometimes in his short stories. And as it happens, Borges actually has an essay specifically on Chesterton that's quite interesting. And he notes, we could say, several tensions or dividing lines that go down within Chesterton's personality, where it's not neat divisions, but something more like a scission, and things are still held together. So he begins by making a contrast with Edgar Allan Poe. He says Edgar Allan Poe wrote stories of two sorts: pure fantastic horror, pure bizarrerie on the one hand, but he also invented the detective story. And he says that is no less certain than the fact that he did not combine the two genres. So Poe has the horror stuff on one side, or the just weird, wacky stuff, and then he's got the detective story on the other side. And Chesterton actually is going to bring these together in a different way. So going back to Poe, he did not inflict on Dupin the task of solving the ancient crime of the man of the crowd, or explaining the image that terrified the masked Prince Prospero in the Chamber of Black and Scarlet. We might also say he didn't require Dupin to figure out what the raven was talking about, saying nevermore or anything like that, right? However, he says, on the other hand, Chesterton lavished such tours de force with passion and joy. And which stories does he focus on? So Chesterton was quite a prolific writer. He focuses on the Father Brown, and he calls it the Father Brown saga. So it's not just individual stories, they are connected together. And I think he's actually quite dead on in his take on the Father Brown stories. Perhaps not every single one of them, but most of them. So he tells us that each story in this saga presents a mystery, right? So we get something that's happened, oftentimes something stolen, or somebody's died, or there's something gone wrong. And then somebody in the story, after some early explanations have been tried out, will then propose something demoniacal or supernatural. And they always expect Father Brown, because he's a little unassuming Catholic priest, to be like, yeah, it probably is the devil or something like that. And Father Brown will typically provide the solution, and it will be what Borges calls a solution of the world. There'll be some sort of natural, scientific, rational explanation for what happened. And Father Brown will often say things like, well, the people who leave behind doctrine and dogma, they wind up being credulous about all sorts of other things. Now, Borges is going to say that skill is not the only virtue of these brief bits of fiction. I believe I can perceive in them an abbreviation of Chesterton's life. So the Father Brown stories tell us something, not just about Father Brown, but about his creator, Chesterton, a symbol or reflection of him. Why? Because there is a repetition of this formula through the years and through the books. What kind of books? Well, The Man Who Knew Too Much, which is also episodic as well, right? The Poet and the Lunatics, The Paradoxes of Mr. Pond. And he says, this confirms that this is an essential form, not a rhetorical artifice. So it's something really characteristic of Chesterton. He says, what I'm going to do here is to try to interpret that. And then he says, first, we should consider some facts that are perhaps too well known. Chesterton is a Catholic. In fact, he was a convert. He believed in the Middle Ages of the pre-Raphaelites. Like Whitman, Chesterton thought the mere fact of existing is so prodigious, no misfortune should exempt us from a kind of cosmic gratitude. And he says that may be a just belief, but it arouses only a limited interest. And to suppose that it is all Chesterton offers is to forget something about having a creed. Now he's going to say two things about having a creed here. So the first thing is that a creed is the underlying factor in a series of mental and emotional processes, and a man is the whole series. A lot of people think of a creed as something that you express propositionally and then you assent to or agree to or argue for. And that may be the way that some people think of a creed, but it's really something that one lives out, that one lives in as well, we could say. Then he talks about another aspect of having a creed. In Argentina, Catholics exalt Chesterton, right, because he's a fellow Catholic. Freethinkers reject him. Like every writer who professes a creed, Chesterton is judged by that creed, condemned or acclaimed because of it. And he makes a really interesting comparison here to a creed which is not religious but political, and we could say an idea of civilization. He says his case is not that unlike that of Kipling, who is always judged with reference to the British Empire. You like the British Empire? You like Kipling. You don't like the British Empire? Kipling's bad, right? You like the idea of God or the Catholic Church? Well, then Chesterton's awesome. And if you don't, well, then get rid of him. And that's a very superficial way of going about things. As a matter of fact, just to take a pause on this, whatever orientation we have, one sign of actually being a properly functioning human being in the sense of having an intellect and using it and not allowing your emotions or your commitments or tribalism to steer you into stupidity is to be able to appreciate those who you don't share a basic creed with, and also to recognize that some who you share a creed with are not really that bright, very often off base. So, leaving those things behind, he comes back to talking about Poe, but now he also brings in Baudelaire and Blake, and he says, Poe and Baudelaire proposed the creation of a world of terror, as did Blake's tormented Urizen. It's natural for their work to team with the forms of horror. They are committed to this, right? And he says, Chesterton would not have tolerated the imputation of being a contriver of nightmares, a monstrorum artifex, to use Pliny's term, right? That's not what Chesterton wants to be about. But, Jorge says, he tends inevitably to revert to atrocious observations. He falls into that in a way very different than, Poe, Baudelaire, and Blake. And he gives all sorts of interesting examples. Let's run through them. He says that he asks if perchance a man has 3 eyes or a bird 3 wings. So that's not too big of a thing. And then he says, in opposition to the pantheists, he speaks of a man who dies and discovers in paradise the spirits of the angelic choirs have, every one of them, the same face he has. Notice he doesn't say his face, because he realizes that this face that I have is just the same as all of those. Now we're starting to get to things that are kind of creepy, right? He speaks of a jail of mirrors, a labyrinth without a center, a man devoured by metal automatons, a tree that devours birds and grows feathers instead of leaves. He imagines, and this is where he cites one of Chesterton's greatest stories, The Man Who Was Thursday. If a man went westward to the end of the world, he would find something, say a tree that was more or less than a tree possessed by a spirit. And if he went east to the end of the world, he would find something else that was not wholly itself, a tower perhaps, of which the very shape was wicked, right? That notion right there is something kind of spooky. He goes on and he says, he defines the near by the far and even by the atrocious. He speaks of eyes. He uses the words of Ezekiel, the terrible crystal. If of the night, he perfects an ancient horror and calls it a monster made of eyes. And he says, here's another story, how I found the Superman. Chesterton speaks to the Superman's parents when he asks him what the child who never leaves a dark room looks like. They remind him that the Superman creates his own law and must be measured by it. On that plane, he is more handsome than Apollo, but viewed from the lower plane of the average man, of course, then they admit it's not easy to shake hands with him because of the difference in structure. This is, suggestive, right? They're not able to state with precision whether he has hair or feathers. And Chesterton relates this tetralogical, monstrous fantasy as a joke. Now, what Borges makes of this, he says, we could easily multiply these examples. They prove that Chesterton restrained himself from being Edgar Allan Poe or Franz Kafka, but something in the makeup of his personality leaned towards the nightmarish, something secret and blind and central. And he goes on to give you some justification for this. One of which is he would repeat that the best book to come out of Germany was Grimm's fairy tales. If you've ever read Grimm's fairy tales and not the bowdlerized, Disneyfied versions of these, they are kind of horror stories, aren't they, right? Or sometimes enigmas, and that's what Chesterton is doing. But there's something in his personality that leans towards the nightmarish, as he's going to say. So he talks also about this discord that involves a precarious subjection of a demoniacal will, and says that this defines Chesterton's nature. And he comes back to talking about Father Brown. Father Brown undertakes to explain an inexplicable event by reason alone. But what is that reason? Is it the cold, calm, collected reason of the enlightened age? Well, not exactly. For Borges, he says that the reason to which Chesterton subjected his imaginings was not precisely reason, but the Catholic faith, or rather a collection of Hebrew imaginings that had been subjected to Plato and Aristotle. And to be fair, we might say nobody's reason is truly reason itself or rational. So it's not brushing him off. Then he's going to finish up by invoking two parables and placing Chesterton between the two of these. One of these is probably very familiar to some readers, that of Kafka's Before the Law, which is often excerpted but belongs to the book The Trial. So it's a story of a man who asked to be admitted to the law. The guardian of the first door says, there are many other doors within. Every room is under the watchful eye of a guardian, each of whom is stronger than the one before. The man sits down to wait. Days and years go by, and the man dies. And at the end he says, is it possible during the years I've been waiting, no one has wanted to enter but me? And the guardian says, no one has wanted to enter this door because it was destined for you alone. Now I shall close it. And he remarks, in the 9th chapter of The Trial, Kafka comments on this parable, making it even more complicated, but also kind of uncanny, horrific in certain ways, isn't it? So that's one kind of parable. You can't get there. And then we have Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, right? People gaze enviously at a castle guarded by many warriors. A guardian at the door holds a book in which he will write the name of the one worthy of entering. An intrepid man approaches the guardian and says, write my name, sir. Then he takes out his sword and lunges at the warriors. There's an exchange of blows. He forces his way through the tumult and enters the castle. What Borges says at the end to conclude this is that Chesterton devoted his life to the writing of the second parable, the Bunyan one, penetrating into the castle, the heroism, the getting through everything, not lapsing into the monstrous, the supernatural. But with something within him always tended to write the first. So what we have here is a Chesterton who is a man of tensions, and, we want to think about Chesterton's own writing. He loved paradoxes, but he himself is rather paradoxical, and Borges is writing rather admiringly of him and quite sympathetically in this essay, trying to, in just the space of a few pages, make sense out of somebody who we know through so many thousands of his own pages in stories and essays that he wrote over the course of his lifetime.